See, the editor from Penguin is here, so maybe I'll tell the blunt truth, which is what when I was trying to recruit somebody for my board yesterday. He leaned over to me and he said, "Look, I'm going to speak bluntly because that's the way I am. So I'm going to speak bluntly. That's the way I am." When I was sent a first cover of for this, it was really terrible. It was really terrible. It really looked like it had been sort of dashed off by a 10-year-old. And whoever designed it, I'm not sure really got it. Didn't understand the period or anything. So I immediately downloaded some of the photographs that were online of the Paris Metro, which is this period, and sent them to Elda, the editor at Penguin. She passed them on to the designer, and the designer, I don't know who the designer was, got it like that. This is exactly the cover. As soon as that person got a little direction, this has not changed. The cover was not changed at all. It just got it. He or she, I don't know who it was, just got it. And all just needed a little direction. And so I think that this really does come from photographs of the Metro from that period. And, I think that that's what it is. And if you see the lines, look at the back. For those of you who bought it, you can look at the back of your books. You can see those lines. For those who haven't bought it, you can buy copies downstairs. But I think you can sort of see the way, the way they grab that stuff, and where you can see that stuff coming from the Fête Gallant paintings and Fragonard stuff that was so popular in the 18th century.
Definitely. Well, so far we've been talking about some of the more serious poems in the book, which I think tend to be the earlier ones, or the ones in the first half.
When I guess he thought at that point he might actually be a poet.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I think he was trying to write seriously.
And you get the sense of there's some ambition and there's some artistic seriousness in these poems, and then sort of some of the later poems are much more about friendship and about writing to your friends, and they're writing back to you in often a sort of lighthearted or silly way. And a nice example of that, I thought, was the one that's number 51, which is untitled, in which he does a little catalog of people who are both friends and then public figures of the time, including Nijinsky and Bakst. And
make sure I know who translated that one. I want to make sure that the translator is credited.
Sure.
That was Nicholas Christopher with Anno on Seda. You want to read that?
Sure.
Moorish, complex as Balzac, quick on his feet, Jean with a smooth complexion and the intense gaze, Lucien, a meticulously sheared poodle, always well scrubbed, plump and pretty, Hermann, who could wear down patience herself, Nijinsky, sublime and explosive, a human rocket who soars across the stage trailing smoke, Bakst, famed for staging The Spectre of the Rose, but also known as a randy donkey. And Boney the dandy, a big doll of a man with a pasty face and overstuffed belly, whose sword is always unsheathed, itching for a duel, and whose stare can also cut you down to size.
So he takes you right into his social world here and also the artistic world. Is there a way of dating this poem based on these references?
You would think it would probably be the first decade of the 20th century when the ballet russes were sort of becoming important or it might be a little bit after that. You remember that 1913 was not only the publication of Swann's Way, it was also the riot in Paris and the Stravinsky riot in Paris. And what's interesting about it is, and one of the things about the notes is, if you look at one of Proust's good friends was Gabriel Astruc. And Gabriel Astruc actually has written a memoir, and a very interesting memoir. Astruc was somebody who actually read the proofs of Swann's Way. And he was also the producer of that evening that resulted in the riot in 1913, because he was the manager of the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. So, sort of like it all goes in together. So all of these people, and also when, for those of you who have read Proust at the Majestic, that wonderful book that came out a couple of years ago, Proust at the Majestic, he was at the Majestic that evening to celebrate a ballet russe production, the last real social appearance that he had in 1922. So it must have been sort of in the teens.
And some of these people who are named in the poem are glossed in the notes. So Jean is Jean Cocteau,
Right.
Lucien is Lucien Daudet, of course Nijinsky and Bakst. And it makes you realize that he was, as you say, living in this modernist moment. I was just at Princeton, and they were doing a conference in Princeton called 1913, the Year of French Modernism.
Mm-hmm.
And this was sort of, he was right in the thick of modernism, and yet, in some way, he doesn't belong in modernism, right? The style that certainly doesn't feel modernist.
Well, I think, the style doesn't. I agree with you. The style doesn't necessarily feel modernist in the way it's been defined.
Mm.
And I'm not really sure that if you define it in a narrow way, then he wouldn't fit there. But if you define it in the way Peter Gay does, for example, in his book on modernism, if you define it as a focus on the self that grew out of the Romantic period and hit its height in the early part of the century, in the modernist period, then yes, he does belong there. So,
yeah.
But with Proust, you can put him in a lot of different categories. You can put him in the phenomenological novel.
Mm.
And you can go in a lot of different categories, which is one of the reasons I think people are always interested in it, because they find a category that they enjoy.
Yeah.
And you put in it. So it is one of the things about that modernist period. Nabokov put the four writers put Kafka, Joyce, Proust, and the Russian. Yeah. Let me say, who's the Russian? I'm trying to remember. Yeah, and he put those four in the modernist camp, and yet they write in very, very different ways. Their styles are completely different.
Yeah. It made me think there's just announced that there's been a major donation to the Metropolitan Museum of Cubist artworks, and that's of course in the same place in the same time as Proust writing, and there's something Cubist maybe about his experiment or his ideas about perspectivism, right? That the way that he sees is that he dissolves things into their component parts, so that even though his prose is quite stately and not at all angular or disjunctive in the way that, as you say, we sometimes think of modernism as being, he also is dissolving perspective and making you see things in new ways.
Well, he did know Picasso. I mean, Picasso was supposed to. There was a date made for Picasso to paint him, and it was never kept. I mean, it didn't come to pass. So I don't know how well he knew, but there was an idea that he was going to paint him. So.
It would be interesting to imagine what Picasso's Proust did. Let's see. So reading these poems, you get the sense of a very close-knit group. Who are some of the protagonists, some of the people? Reynaldo Hahn is the addressee of a number of them.
Well, I think Reynaldo Hahn is the most important one. And I think that when he meets Reynaldo Hahn, fairly early in his life, in his 20s, and Hahn is even younger. I don't even think Hahn is in his 20s yet. That really became the most important non-family relationship in his life. And throughout his life, he said the only person, Celeste actually says in her memoir, that the only person who was allowed in Proust's room without knocking is Reynaldo Hahn. And you do see these things that when Enid Bagnall's autobiography, she talks about going to Proust's home and having to wait outside when her friend Antoine Bibesco goes in to see Proust, but Proust, usually unshaven, with dirty linen, does not want to see anybody he doesn't really know that well, so he doesn't even clean himself up. Bibesco goes in, and Enid Bagnall never goes in, never meets Proust, really, even though she's just waiting right outside.
And Hahn, they have a lot of sort of private language, they have pet names and joke names.
It's really kind of a funny thing, I don't see anything like that in the novel at all, but you see these the whole, the way, when you see Proust as a sort of like childish jokester, I mean, if you had said to most people in the United States or wherever that, oh yeah, Proust was in his real life was a childish jokester, after when they look at this giant novel, I think they would find it hard to believe. But you read some of this stuff, and he's got almost like baby talk, and they had a private language that they carried into their 50s. I mean, when they're talking about secrets, we're known as tombeau, the tomb, and they called each other by pet names, and they made sort of a made-up language that you can see in these poems.
Yeah, they call each other Bunch and Gunch.
Bunch and Gunst and Binnables, and I mean, it's like, You know, you sort of say, these guys are in their 40s. What goes on here? Imagine if we did this now, and you know, I just can't imagine. And yet, you sort of look at it and you see Proust as a serious guy, you know, writing away against time, you know, just trying, you know, writing and writing and writing and throwing papers on the floor and pasting things in and trying to get things right. And then he's like got, you know, Ronaldo Hahn walks in and he calls them bindables.
So it's another example, which the book brings out as well, of the sort of disjunction between the man and the artist, which is, of course, one of his great themes, one of the things that he insists on. One of the only moments where I think that there's maybe a verbal connection between the poem and the novel is this very sort of racy or obscene poem called Jeune fille en fleur, which, is it too obscene to read, do you think? Or
Is it too obscene to read?
We're all grown-ups here?
Most of them wouldn't think it would be obscene enough. Which one is it?
It's number 54.
54. Budding young girls. Let's just make sure to translate this.
Jennifer Moxley.
Jennifer Moxley, okay. Budding young girls. Let Wagner keep Erda, that tiresome slip of foul silk who made Wotan forget the blue skies. Even though any squall can turn the exquisite sea of Marmora into a mire that would capsize many sailboats, if let to sink or too late shortened sail, if Saint Medardus was appeased but to no avail, Medardus from merda, the Latin for sink shit. But don't let's belabor it, for we should sacrifice what etymology itself can't admit, things without beauty, for example, shit. You who crown me, dressed in rich satines, otter or tweed, budding young tweens, forget brooding darks, prefer the prism, it evokes the white jellyfish's ultramarine. Of that singular nectar to you alone so pleasing, budding young girls, O swallower of
The missing word is
jism.
jism. So this is sort of like Proust in quasi-pornographic mode. And in the novel, he's so delicate about descriptions of sexual encounters, and in fact almost euphemistic. So he'll be wrestling with Gilbert, right? And then the wrestling leads to a sexual encounter. But then we turn to this book and we see him writing sort of full out about sex.
He never expected it to see the light of day.
Yeah.
To his friends. I mean, I think that, you know, the private discourse is going to be different from the public discourse. He probably couldn't get away with, you know, he definitely couldn't get away with those things. I mean, you know that they're going on, but he couldn't get away with that. You know, he's lucky he got away with some of the discussions of homosexuality. And I think that the encounter between Julien and Charlus that is all implied is a pretty hefty encounter when you come, you know, when you think it's in the second decade of the 19th century, the 20th century.
And that's that great scene where he compares the meeting to a flower and a bird or butterfly fertilizing a flower.
Yeah.
A bumblebee fertilizing a flower.
Well, you know, that's an interesting passage, though, too. Is that I've always felt that that was when you said it's all about Jews and homosexuals, well, I actually think that that's the fulcrum of the novel, where it goes from Jews to homosexuals. And the preponderance goes from the first half of the book, which it's almost in the middle, and it's really about that. And what's interesting about it, too, is that, remember, that scene happens after, in chronology, that scene happens before the previous scene.
Right.
So he's actually moved that in time in order to move off into a different realm at that point.
Yeah.
And it really does, because he also, remember, he starts talking about Jews at that point and relating homosexuals to Jews as sort of the outside race, the subaltern race, and, you know, actually makes a transition. And there's so much more about homosexuality in the second half of the book. And he's moved from Jews to homosexuality.
There's that moment where he sort of breaks perspective and he says, I was coming down the stairs on my way to Madame de Guermantes, the Princess de Guermantes, someone, and I saw something amazing in the courtyard of the inn, but I'm not going to tell you about it now. And then he postpones it until the next volume, as though to emphasize.
And that's a narrative technique. He specifically wants to change the narrative on you, that it's not, you know, he's not going to do it that way.
Yeah.
What's interesting, too, about that scene is, I don't know, for those of you who've actually been to the different places where Proust lived in Paris, in Rue de Courcelles, where he lived with his parents, you can actually see, if you go in there, it's now the Colombian consulate, you can actually see how he would have sat on the stairs looking through this big picture window of what was going on in the courtyard. It's really kind of a revelation because nobody ever goes there because it's closed. And it's very interesting to see how he put it together. Because most people just sort of figure that it's some sort of house that would be in the 7th, you know, one of those big mansions that would be in the 7th and only small. But this, you can actually see how he made it bigger in the book, but how he transposed it. Everything's bigger in the book in many ways. I mean, if you go to Combray, Ile Combray, you can see how small that garden is. It seems much bigger in the book.
Do we have time for more discussion? Should we move to questions? Questions? All right. So let's open up the discussion to questions about Proust and poetry. Yes.
Considering the criticism that Penguin got for the multiple voices of translators on the novel translation about 10 or 13 years ago, how did you handle the multiplicity of translators and try to maintain some consistency in voice?
Well, you know, I think that it's an interesting point about the criticism that Penguin got for the different voices, because they are in many ways very different, even though they were edited by the same person in the end. I didn't bother with that. To be perfectly honest, I just said, you know, I want to see how different people look at it. Because there are different voices. Proust had different voices at different times in his life. I don't think he was looking for any sort of continuity, whereas in the novel, I think that there is an attempted continuity. And the attempted continuity, you can see, is thematic and its diction, and you have to be able to understand that in the first volume and the last volume, there are word choices that are very specific. So they really have to be that way. But I don't think that wasn't as big a question to me in the book. And I was very aware of it. And at first, the idea was for one person to translate the entire book. But that wasn't my first choice. My first choice really was to have many different translators take a look at it and, to be honest, to have a good time with it. And just have fun with it. The verse was not really meant as this giant lapidary thing the way the novel was. And it's supposed to be fun. I mean, once you get past the early period, the poems are fun. And, you know, so it didn't matter as much. And I didn't care. And I think some of the poets who did the work on it did take very, very different. Rosanna Warren really decided that she was going to be as vulgar as she actually called me afterwards and said, you know, I want to use these two poems in my class. Is it all right with you? And I said, sure, it's fine with me. And there was a pause, and she said, you know, I can't. Because they are very vulgar, and you have to, you know, be careful about that. But she decided to take, you know, her diction is very vulgar. And she didn't have to do that because it's not really there in that format. But she had a good time with it, and good for her.
Other questions? I'm sure with all these Proustians.
I think along the same lines you're talking about the early Proust and how it took him his entire life to discover his genre. And what Harold just said about the different voices, I think one of the fascinating points about the poem, looking forward to rereading it all again, is that Proust hasn't found his voice. And so you get all of these, as you pointed out so well, for example, the begging young girls, the scandalogical side. He's going to give that to Charlus. You hear that many times in Charlus, and also in Swann. And so I think a lot of what you get in the poems is Proust, as a young writer, really experimenting with different voices and different points of view. And then also a lot of the thematic material, however. You can see those in the themes in the poems too. But he has no idea at that point, when he wrote so many of them, what his story was. You know, you can actually write a masterpiece about how he can't write, which is one of the great Proustian tricks.
Other questions? Yes.
What did you learn about yourself?
What did I learn about?
So what did you learn about yourself after spending a very long time with a writer about who you thought yourself?
The question was, what did you learn about yourself from the experience of
A writer who focused on himself.
No, sorry, I stand up. What did you learn about yourself after spending such a very long time with a writer about whom you thought you knew a lot?
Well, you know, one of the things about the first thing I learned, I think, was that the whole idea, as I said before, about Proust and friendship. I think that that was quite a revelation to me. I mean, I knew about it to a certain extent from reading the biography, that friendship was important to him, but I didn't realize how much, you know, how important it was. Because it's not only from reading the poems. I mean, I read a lot of memoirs about Proust. And what was interesting about it is that there are loads of memoirs about Proust that were written in the 20s after he died. Loads and loads of them. And, you know, I think that that happens from time to time about with writers, and I can't imagine that there would be too many writers, contemporary writers, I'm talking about contemporary hour period, that a half dozen to a dozen people would write about them within 10 years after they died, and memoirs about them, and publish their letters. I guess it's possible, but I'm not sure who that would be at this point. So, you know, the loyalty, I think, was really quite extraordinary to me. Now, what did I learn about myself in reading the stuff? I'm not really sure. I think you probably have to ask my wife, so, because she knows more about me than I know about myself. So I think, you know, this actually took a long time to see the light of day, and I think more than anything else, what the passion that I actually felt about this writer really came out again and again and again and again. And you know, it's the sort of thing where you know, I got to the point where I could not stop talking about Proust. I mean, I immersed myself for about a year and a half in only reading very personal things about Proust. And as I said, I didn't really learn very much about myself because I decided not to examine myself. We'll go into that later. You know, I don't want to. You know, you're asking too much about my personality. But I learned, you know, you know, a lot about my own obsessions. I mean, I remember when I took my current job, and I was just really beginning this, and I went to St. Paul to announce the National Book Award finalists with Garrison Keillor at the Fitzgerald Theater in St. Paul. And it was really quite something because, I mean, Garrison Keillor is about 8'3" and kind of rumpled, and I come from New York, and I was wearing, you know, a chalk-striped, double-breasted blue suit, and, you know, with a pocket square, and so the two of us are standing next to each other, and I'm not really tall. I mean, you can't tell because I'm sitting down, but I'm not tall. And so the contrast of the two of us meeting the press afterwards, in the middle of trying to discuss, you know, this stuff with the press, and the press is asking questions, and he leans over to me, and he says, "So this Proust thing, is it an interest or an obsession?" And I gave him the stock answer was, "Well, if you ask me, it's an interest. If you ask my wife, it's an obsession." So that's what I kind of learned about myself, that it was easy for me to get obsessed with Proust. What's interesting about it now is that even though I still read Proust every day, a little bit of Proust every day, I'm working on something completely different. So I sort of have to go in a different direction and, you know, think about other things. But if I had my druthers, would I be sitting in a cafe in Paris reading Proust every day, day after day? Yes, I would. You know, yes, okay, it's an obsession.
I think we could all agree to that. Yes?
I'm curious, you had mentioned earlier that Proust was more appreciated by the German and the American reader than the French. What do you think might have caused that the French didn't claim him more quickly?
Well, you know, it also maybe, you know, a lot of times great writers are not prophets in their own country. And, you know, just to give you an example of the American writers who are read, you know, not read a great deal here, Paul Auster, for example, Richard Powers. Paul Auster, you know, I remember seeing Paul Auster, we did an interview with Paul Auster at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. And there were, I'd say, half a dozen young Japanese women in the audience, and afterwards, the attitude, the physical, the body attitude when they came near Paul Auster was just extraordinary. He was like beyond rock star in Japan. He sells an amazing amount in France. Richard Powers, who said he would sell 20,000 copies of his books here, told me he sold 250,000 in Germany. I mean, he went on a big meeting tour in Germany, but in the United States, nothing. I mean, I think why does he speak to the Americans? Why does he speak to the Germans? Why does Proust speak to the Japanese? I think you probably have to really go into the whole, the whole psyche of the country. And I'm not sure you really can, but, I really do think, about 10 years ago when we were doing a Proust group session here, I invited, it was in 2000, I invited an academic from the University of Toulouse to come to the Proust session. And there were about 40 or 50 people, which is what we usually got, and we finished the session. She didn't say anything, but she was taking notes. And she came up to me afterwards and she said, "This would never happen in France. A couple of people might sit down and discuss Proust in a cafe, but the idea that a community of readers would get together to discuss Proust would not happen." That's what she said to me. So maybe it has something to do with that. Maybe it has something to do with the community orientation. Maybe it has something to do with sharing. Maybe it has something to do with jealousy. Maybe it has something to do with, I don't know. But it's interesting because there's a young woman who's writing the Revue de Monde, is devoting an issue in June to Proust in America. And she's writing this. She lives in the United States, and she's writing it. She's collecting lots of information. And she asked me the same question, why did I think that first of all, she asked me where I got that, and I can't remember, it's in my notes somewhere. But it's an interesting question of why the French didn't embrace Proust right away.
Do you think his Jewishness or his homosexuality had anything to do with that?
I don't know. Did they embrace Gide in those days? And I think they did. So who can tell? I think one of the things was that Proust definitely was embraced. One of the things about these notes is, when you read the notes, and remember the epigraph to the notes is Marcel Proust read footnotes, is that Proust was in a set. And one of the things that I was told the first time I went to Paris is that when you come from New York, you think that there's a scene, because New York is filled with scenes. And when you come to Paris, you realize that Paris is made up of sets. And Proust is in this very specific set in Paris. And he is embraced by that set all the way through his career and after he dies. So they even have costume parties of people dressed as Proustian characters. But I think it was somewhat limited, and the intellectuals at the time were not really going to read, Proust at then. But his set read him, and then it sort of blossomed from there.
Just today, I finished reading Samuel Beckett's book on Proust. He did not like Proust. He wrote it in French, and I'm sure that the French public, the intellectual class at least, would have read that book. At that time, it was published in 1931. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, well, the Beckett book, I guess, was sort of complicated about Proust. I mean, I don't know if he just didn't like Proust.
Well, not personally. He didn't like to write it.
Yeah.
It seems to me.
Well, Proust also went through it. Bill would probably have better insight. Proust was eclipsed for a period of time, certainly in the 50s, when people were writing the anti-Proust stuff, and the new novel was very much, a lot of anti-Proust, because, there is a sort of, I don't want to call it a Baroque sensibility, but the complexity versus the simplicity that was growing up in the 50s would be this sort of anti-Proust, there would be a Proust reaction against Proust. So you can sort of see why that would happen. I mean, he is a giant figure with a giant book, and so if you have that type of complexity and you're looking for simplicity in that novel in the 1950s, in the new novel, you're not going to like Proust.
I think we have time for 2 more questions before we have some wine.
Of course, I'm very interested in the longest sentence, which quite exactly comes right after the Bumblebee and Japan and Charlene. And that is, if that's not poetry, I'd like to know what it
It's a series of linked subordinate clauses.
But, and it sounds like choice. It's the beginning of really, really modern writing. And of course it is in the center of the book, and it is almost directly in the center.
Well,
with Joyce, you could start counting pages.
Yeah, one of the things that was really interesting, but when Richard Howard spoke here in 1995, someone correct me if I'm wrong, and he talked about, oh no, it was later on, I'm sorry, when he talked about dilation. And I think it's a very interesting word for Proust. So that sentence, I think, actually gets dilation. When you can, because what you can do is when you link subordinate clauses, you can dilate and dilate and dilate, and everybody knows that he had these 2 volumes, and then 3 volumes, and then 7 volumes, and there are scholars who think that had he lived, it would be 9 volumes. So it's not necessarily that he's going to change the beginning and the end, but he's going to dilate the middle.
Right.
And that sentence, I think, is probably a very interesting example of superdilation. So he just continues to dilate that more and more and more and more. And I've read that, I have that sentence on my wall. It's a poster, I have it on my wall. Right, I'm obsessed. So,
I gave it to you.
so I have that on my wall, and I still cannot, and it's diagrammed. Remember, it's diagrammed. So I still cannot figure out if there really is a subject and a predicate. It's 959 words, 929 words, and I still can't figure out if there really is a subject and a predicate. It's just subordinate clause after subordinate clause after subordinate clause, and you get to the end and you say, what?
Not what, because what he's doing is talking right then and there
Yes.
about the Jewish and the homosexual, which are the 2, as you put out, the 2 prime things, beginning with, so much about the family and Jewish family and Jewish thing, and in the end, forget about that. As soon as the grandmother died, gone, and then you're into homosexuality. Almost as if the book's cut in half.
Anyone want to ask the last question?
I would just say, I think the irony that you were talking earlier about the quality of importance of the ambiguous, and as this lady's just said, I don't know anyone's prose who is more phonetically and musical than Proust.
Yeah.
So,
Maybe he put his poetic impulses into his prose.
I'm just curious to know, Harold, if the production of poems stopped once he came into the conception, the definitive conception for the book. That's 1908, 1909. Does the writing of poetry stop then, or are there still occasional poems?
There are occasional poems, but they are generally very, very short and almost epigrammatic. Yeah, I think what you're getting to is that he was putting his energies into something else and really wasn't as important to him. So there are very, very few of them. I mean, there are some that appear. There are a couple in the book, for example, that were written as just these little ditties to his servants, and just sort of said, make sure that there's melon on the menu. I mean, that's sort of what it says. And so I think that you're absolutely right. It's an avocation when he's trying to figure out what his voice is, but he's not doing that anymore. Everything is going into the book at that point, almost everything.
The rest of his
And he's also, remember, he's got less of a social life. Yeah.
He's retreated from the world.
Yeah.
The rest of his life is an emergency to finish this.
Yeah. I mean, he still goes out, but not nearly as much as he